You don't think about trains much until you're stuck on one. That night, I learned it's better to miss the last train than take one you don't recognize. I don't even know if it was real, but it felt real enough to haunt me every time I closed my eyes. It started like any other late commute. My usual ride was cancelled, and I was stuck waiting at the station. The departures board glitched and flickered as I stood under the pale fluorescent lights. A single train remained on the schedule, Route 66. I'd never seen it before, but I was desperate to get home. When it pulled in, I felt off. The train screeched to a halt, its sound like a scream. The exterior was worn and stained, the windows cloudy as if fogged from the inside. I told myself I was being paranoid. A train's a train, right? I stepped aboard, and the doors shut with an ominous hiss behind me. Inside, the air was colder than the outside night. It made my breath visible. The floor was damp, though it hadn't rained. The smell, it was faint but rancid, like rotting leaves or meat left too long in the sun. I tried to shake the feeling off and found a seat by the window, one of the few clean ones. There weren't many passengers. The first was a man in a trench coat, sitting at the far end of the carriage. He didn't look up, didn't even seem to breathe. The brim of his hat cast his face in shadow. Across from me, a frail old woman muttered to herself, rocking back and forth. Her hands clutched a beaten leather bag so tightly her knuckles were bone white. The train jolted forward, and I settled in, trying to lose myself in my phone. But there was no signal. No Wi-Fi. Even the time on my phone glitched, the numbers flickering like they couldn't decide what they should be. The discomfort was growing, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I glanced out the window. At first, it was just darkness. But as the train moved, I realized it wasn't normal darkness. It was empty. No stars, no trees, no city lights, just a void. I looked for any sign of where we were going, but there weren't even tracks beneath us. It felt like the train was floating in nothingness. The first sound came a few minutes later. A scraping noise, faint but sharp, like nails on metal. I turned, thinking it was something from outside, but the void remained silent. Then the lights in the carriage flickered, plunging us into brief moments of shadow. Each time they came back on, it felt like something had shifted. The old woman's muttering stopped, replaced by shallow, panicked breaths. I looked at her and saw she was staring at the aisle, eyes wide with terror. I followed her gaze, but the aisle was empty. The trench coat man hadn't moved. Yet the scraping sound came again, louder, closer. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my seat. "Did you hear that?" I asked. The old woman didn't answer. She just hugged her bag tighter and whispered, "Don't look at it. Don't look at it." Her words sent chills down my spine. "What do you mean?" "Don't look at what?" Before she could answer, the lights flickered again. This time, the darkness stayed a little longer. When they returned, the trench coat man was different. His hat had slid off, and his head, it was smooth. Featureless. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just blank, pale skin stretched over a skull. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I looked back at the old woman, hoping for some kind of explanation, but she was trembling, her lips moving silently in prayer. And then I saw the reflection. At first, I thought it was me. But it wasn't. In the window, a pale figure stared back at me. Its face, if you could call it that, was warped, with hollow pits where its eyes should have been. Its mouth was too wide, stretching unnaturally as if frozen mid-scream. It stood in the aisle, watching me. My stomach dropped. I turned around, but nothing was there. The scraping sound grew louder, joined by a wet, rasping breath. I clutched the seat, frozen. The old woman screamed, throwing her bag down the aisle as the thing finally showed itself. It crawled into the light, its body contorted, limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its head twitched side to side, the hollow pits of its eyes locking on me. Its skin was slick, almost translucent, and it moved with a jerking, insect-like rhythm. The old woman backed against her seat, sobbing. "You shouldn't have looked. It follows those who look." The thing lunged at her. She shrieked, but it was no use. In one flicker of light, she was there, screaming. In the next, she was gone. Her bag lay open on the floor, spilling its contents, old letters, photographs, a crumpled map. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted toward the door at the end of the carriage, but it wouldn't open. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. Behind me, the scraping sound returned, faster now, like claws raking across the metal floor. The lights went out completely. I heard it breathing, felt it getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop. And then, the train jolted to a halt. The doors hissed open, and I stumbled out onto a platform. I don't know where it was, there were no signs, no people. Just fog and silence. I turned back, but the train was gone. I wandered for hours before I found a road and flagged down a car. The driver didn't believe me. Nobody did. They told me there's no such thing as Route 66, that the last train doesn't run at my station. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, I still hear that scraping sound at night. Sometimes, I see that reflection in windows, watching me with hollow eyes. And I know one thing, it hasn't stopped following me. So, if you ever find yourself on a late-night train, and you hear something creeping behind you, don't look. No matter what you do, don't look. It was late, past midnight, when I finally finished my work. My company's office was in a tall building downtown, and by that hour, the parking garage was empty. You know how creepy those places can be, all concrete and shadows. Multiply that by 10 when you're the only one there. I took the elevator down to the lowest level where my car was parked. As soon as the doors opened, I felt it, this weird, heavy silence. The lights flickered, just a little, and my footsteps echoed too loudly. My car was parked at the far end of the garage, so I started walking. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. It was long and dark, stretching out from behind one of the pillars. But as I got closer, I realized it didn't make sense. The angle was wrong, and there was nothing that could have cast it. It just existed, lying there like something waiting to pounce. I stopped, staring at it, my gut screaming at me to turn around and leave. But then it moved. It slid across the floor, darting to another pillar, like it was alive. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. I started walking faster, my keys clutched in my hand. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and every time I did, the shadow was closer. It wasn't crawling or walking, it was just there, growing and stretching like it was following me without moving. By the time I reached my car, I was practically running. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them once, twice, before finally getting the door open. I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned the engine on. When I looked up, the shadow was right in front of me. It didn't have a shape, not really. It was like a person, but distorted, stretched too thin and too tall. Its edges flickered like static, and there were no eyes, no face, just darkness. It leaned toward the car, its head tilting like it was trying to see me. I don't know how I managed to move, but I slammed the car into reverse and tore out of there. The last thing I saw as I sped out of the garage was the shadow. It didn't chase me, it just stood there, watching. I haven't been back to that garage since. Hell, I haven't stayed late at work again. And every now and then, when I'm driving at night, I think I see it in the rearview mirror, just for a second. But that's enough. You know how people say, don't stop at those creepy roadside motels? I always thought that was just horror movie nonsense. But after what happened to me, I'll never stay in one again. My car broke down late at night, in the middle of nowhere. The only place nearby was this dingy little motel. It looked like it had been built in the 70s and hadn't been touched since. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, missing letters. But I didn't have a choice. I was tired, it was late, and I wasn't about to sleep in my car. The guy at the front desk barely looked up when I walked in. He handed me a key with a faded tag that read, Room 12. His hand lingered for a second, like he was about to say something, but then he just muttered, enjoy your stay, and went back to whatever he was doing. The room was exactly what I expected, small, ugly, and smelled faintly of mold. But the door had a lock, and the bed looked halfway decent, so I figured it would do for the night. I locked the door, dropped the key on the nightstand, and lay down. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember was a knocking sound. It was faint at first, like someone tapping on the door. I thought maybe it was the wind or a branch, so I ignored it. But then it got louder. Not pounding, just insistent, rhythmic knocking. I sat up, my heart pounding. Who is it? I called out. No answer. The knocking stopped. I stared at the door for a long moment, but everything was silent. I told myself it was probably nothing and lay back down. That's when I saw the key. It was back in the door. I was sure I'd left it on the nightstand, but now it was hanging from the lock, like someone had put it there. My stomach dropped. Someone had been in the room. I grabbed the key, locked the door again, and checked the window. It was locked too. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was just tired, maybe I had left the key there after all. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. Then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just the door. It was coming from the window too, from the walls, from all around me. I jumped up, shouting, "Who's there? What do you want?" But all I got in return was more knocking, faster and louder. It surrounded me, filling the room like a drumbeat. I grabbed my stuff and bolted out of there. The knocking followed me down the hallway, echoing off the walls. When I got to the front desk, the clerk was gone. The lobby was dark, and the only sound was that damn knocking. I ran outside to my car. It started on the first try, thank God, and I peeled out of there, tires screeching. When I looked back in the rearview mirror, I saw someone standing in the doorway of room 12, holding the key. You don't expect much from a train station at night. It's supposed to be quiet, empty. But that night was different. I had just finished a late shift at work, and I was exhausted. By the time I got to the station, it was close to midnight. There were only a couple of people around, a guy with a newspaper sitting a few benches down and this old man leaning against the wall, staring at the tracks like he'd forgotten why he was there. I sat down on the bench, checked the schedule, and sighed when I saw the train was delayed. Typical, right? I pulled out my phone to kill time, but my battery was almost dead. Just my luck. That's when I noticed him. At the far end of the platform, there was a man in a suit. He was standing completely still, facing away from me. Something about him felt wrong. He was too stiff, like he wasn't even breathing. I told myself he was just waiting for the train, same as me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I looked away, focusing on my phone. When I glanced back, the man was closer. He hadn't turned around, hadn't made a sound, but he was definitely closer. My stomach twisted. I looked around, hoping someone else had noticed him, but the guy with the newspaper was gone. So was the old man. It was just me and the man in the suit. I stood up, trying to act casual, and walked toward the middle of the platform. The man didn't move. I kept walking, putting as much distance between us as I could. But when I glanced back, he was closer again. I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey, I shouted. "What do you want?" No response. He didn't move, didn't turn around. But now I could hear something, this faint, high-pitched hum, like static, coming from where he stood. My skin prickled. Then the train arrived. I ran to the nearest door and jumped on without looking back. The car was empty. I found a seat, trying to calm down, telling myself it was all in my head. As the train pulled out of the station, I glanced out the window. The platform was empty, except for him. He was standing there, staring straight at me. His face. I'll never forget it. His eyes were too wide, too dark, and his mouth was stretched into this horrible, frozen grin. "I don't take the train anymore,"